They were the mightiest weapons ever built. Floating fortresses of steel bristling with guns so massive they could hurl a 1-ton shell 20 miles across the ocean. For generations, battleships ruled the waves as undisputed monarchs of naval power. Nations measured their strength by the number of these titans in their fleets, and admirals dreamed of the decisive gun battle that would determine the fate of empires. But in the space of just a few catastrophic hours on a quiet Sunday morning in December 1941, everything changed. The age of the battleship died at Pearl Harbor, and a new era of naval warfare was born, one dominated by a weapon that didn't even exist 25 years earlier. This is the story of how aircraft carriers revolutionized naval combat and rewrote the rules of war at sea. The battleship's reign had seemed eternal and absolute. These magnificent vessels represented the pinnacle of industrial might and military engineering. The largest battleships of World War II displaced over 70,000 tons and stretched longer than 3 football fields. Their main batteries consisted of guns measuring 16 inches or more in diameter, capable of penetrating thick armor plating from vast distances. The very presence of a battleship task force could alter the strategic calculus of entire campaigns. Great Britain's Royal Navy had built its empire on battleship supremacy. Japan's naval doctrine centered on the decisive battleship engagement. Even the United States, despite its industrial prowess, measured naval power primarily in battleships right up until the eve of World War II. The logic behind battleship dominance seemed unassailable. Naval warfare had always been about closing with the enemy and bringing superior firepower to bear. For centuries, this meant sailing ships of the line exchanging broadsides at close range. The Industrial Revolution replaced wooden hulls with iron and steel, added steam propulsion, and developed increasingly powerful naval guns. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Victory went to the fleet with heavier guns, thicker armor, and better tactical positioning. The battleship embodied this philosophy perfectly. Its massive guns could destroy any ship afloat, while its heavy armor belt could withstand tremendous punishment. Naval theorists and officers worldwide considered the battleship the ultimate expression of sea power. Yet even as battleships reached their zenith in size and capability during the 1930s, a few visionary officers began questioning their continued dominance. The aircraft carrier, initially developed during World War I as a specialized platform for reconnaissance planes, had evolved into something far more interesting. By the 1930s, carriers could launch and recover dozens of aircraft capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away. This represented a fundamental shift in naval warfare, the ability to project power beyond the visual horizon without requiring the fleet itself to come within range of enemy guns. But these ideas remained controversial and largely theoretical. Most naval establishments dismissed carriers as auxiliary vessels, useful for scouting and protecting the main battle fleet, but incapable of decisive action on their own. The Japanese Navy proved more receptive to carrier aviation than most. Japan's strategic situation demanded innovative thinking. As an island nation dependent on overseas resources, Japan needed to dominate the Western Pacific. However, international naval treaties limited the size of Japan's battleship fleet relative to the United States and Britain. Carriers offered a potential way to offset this disadvantage. Throughout the 1930s, Japan invested heavily in carrier development and naval aviation. Japanese carrier pilots trained relentlessly, becoming among the most skilled naval aviators in the world. Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers represented the cutting edge of naval aviation technology. By 1941, Japan possessed the world's most formidable carrier strike force. 6 large fleet carriers with highly trained air crews and proven combat experience from operations in China. The United States Navy had also invested in carrier development, but American naval doctrine still centered on the battleship. The U.S. possessed 7 fleet carriers by late 1941, with several more under construction. American naval exercises throughout the 1930s explored carrier tactics and capabilities, yet most senior officers still viewed carriers as supporting units for the battleship fleet. The decisive engagement in American thinking would still be fought with big guns at relatively close range, with carriers providing reconnaissance and air cover. This mindset pervaded the Navy's upper echelons despite growing evidence that aircraft posed a serious threat to surface ships. When the simmering tensions between the United States and Japan finally erupted into war, this conventional wisdom was about to face its ultimate test.
December 7, 1941, dawned clear and calm over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The U.S. Pacific Fleet lay at anchor, with 8 battleships moored along Battleship Row. These vessels represented America's primary naval striking power in the Pacific. Their crews prepared for a routine Sunday morning, with many men ashore on weekend liberty. Few imagined that Japanese carriers had approached to within 200 miles of Hawaii under complete secrecy, launching a devastating strike force of over 300 aircraft in 2 waves. The first wave arrived shortly before 8 in the morning, achieving complete tactical surprise. Japanese bombers and torpedo planes fell upon the American battleships with devastating precision. The attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated the carrier's destructive potential in the most dramatic terms possible. In less than 2 hours, Japanese carrier aircraft sank or severely damaged all 8 American battleships present. The Arizona exploded catastrophically, taking over 1,000 men to the bottom. The Oklahoma capsized completely. The California and West Virginia settled into the mud, while the Nevada, attempting to escape to sea, ran aground to avoid sinking in the harbor channel. The destruction was overwhelming and undeniable. The attack killed over 2,000 Americans and temporarily crippled the Pacific Fleet's battleship strength. Yet the Japanese strike force accomplished this devastating blow without losing a single carrier. The attackers had struck from beyond visual range, delivered their ordnance, and withdrawn before the American fleet could mount any effective response with conventional naval weapons. The strategic implications of Pearl Harbor reverberated immediately. The U.S. Pacific Fleet's battle line had been effectively destroyed in a single morning. Yet the war was far from over. The Japanese planners had failed to achieve one critical objective. Not a single American aircraft carrier had been in port during the attack. The Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all at sea on various missions when the Japanese struck. These 3 carriers, along with additional flat tops rushed from the Atlantic, would become the foundation of America's naval response. With the battleships gone, American naval strategy had no choice but to pivot toward carrier-based operations. What began as desperate necessity would soon prove to be a strategic blessing in disguise. The Pearl Harbor attack had forced the U.S. Navy to embrace the future of naval warfare years ahead of when institutional inertia might otherwise have permitted. The months following Pearl Harbor saw Japanese forces sweep across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with stunning success. Japanese carrier aircraft supported amphibious landings throughout the region, providing air superiority and striking power that overwhelmed Allied defenses. The British learned the hard way that even modern battleships were vulnerable to air attack when operating without adequate air cover. In December 1941, Japanese land-based bombers sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse off the coast of Malaya. These modern capital ships, dispatched to deter Japanese aggression, went to the bottom in a matter of hours under sustained air attack. The lesson was unmistakable.
In the vast expanses of the Pacific, where land-based air cover was often unavailable, carriers had become essential for survival, let alone victory. The first significant carrier confrontation of the war erupted in the Coral Sea during early May 1942. American intelligence had detected Japanese plans for an amphibious assault on Port Moresby in New Guinea, which would threaten Australia's northern approaches. For the first time in naval history, two carrier task forces sought each other across thousands of square miles of ocean, with the opposing ships never coming within sight of one another. The Battle of the Coral Sea was fought entirely by aircraft. American and Japanese carriers launched strikes at each other while remaining hundreds of miles apart. The Americans lost the carrier Lexington and suffered damage to the Yorktown, while Japanese forces lost the light carrier Shoho and sustained damage to the fleet carrier Shokaku. Though tactically inconclusive, the Coral Sea demonstrated that carrier versus carrier combat had become the new paradigm for naval warfare. It was decided by aircraft and aircrew skill, not by the size of guns or thickness of armor. Just 1 month later, the nature of carrier warfare became even more apparent at the Battle of Midway, arguably the most decisive naval engagement of the entire war. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto planned a complex operation to seize Midway Atoll and draw out the remaining American carriers for destruction. Yamamoto assembled the most powerful naval force Japan had ever deployed, including 4 fleet carriers of the Kido Butai, the same strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, supported by numerous battleships and cruisers. The Japanese expected to overwhelm the Americans through superior numbers and tactical skill, but American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese naval communications, giving Admiral Nimitz critical intelligence about Japanese intentions and timing. The Americans positioned 3 carriers northeast of Midway in a perfect ambush position, turning Japanese expectations of surprise completely around.
The battle began in the early morning of June 4, 1942. Japanese carriers launched a strike against Midway's installations, while American land-based aircraft mounted ineffective attacks against the Japanese fleet. Japanese Admiral Nagumo faced a critical decision when reports indicated American carriers were in the area. His aircraft were being rearmed for a second strike against Midway when he needed them loaded for anti-ship operations. This delay proved fatal. American dive bombers arrived overhead while Japanese carriers had their decks crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft. In approximately 5 minutes, American dive bombers scored devastating hits on 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. All 3 were set ablaze and later sank. A 4th carrier, Hiruyu, launched a counterstrike that badly damaged the Yorktown before American aircraft found and destroyed Hiruyu as well. By the end of the day, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable trained aviators. The Americans lost 1 carrier but had decisively shifted the Pacific balance of power. Midway proved that carriers were now the capital ships that mattered. The Japanese fleet at Midway included powerful battleships that played virtually no role in the engagement. These massive vessels, representing enormous investments in material and manpower, could only watch helplessly as aircraft determined the battle's outcome hundreds of miles away. The Japanese battleships' big guns never fired a shot at enemy ships. Their heavy armor provided no protection against an enemy they could neither see nor reach. The entire action revolved around the carriers, their aircraft, and their crews. Whoever controlled the air controlled the sea. This reality would govern every subsequent major naval engagement in the Pacific War. The nature of carrier operations differed fundamentally from traditional naval warfare in ways that extended far beyond mere tactics. Carriers required completely different types of ships, organizational structures, and logistics. The carrier itself was vulnerable, lacking the heavy armor and guns of a battleship. Its strength lay entirely in its aircraft. This meant carriers needed escorts, destroyers and cruisers to provide anti-aircraft defense and screen against submarines.
The carrier task force became a combined arms team where every ship played a specific role in protecting and projecting the carrier's striking power. This organizational approach contrasted sharply with the battleship-centered task forces that had dominated earlier naval thinking, where other ships primarily existed to support the battleship's gun duels with enemy capital ships. Carriers also demanded entirely new types of personnel and training. Naval aviation required pilots, aircrew, maintenance personnel, flight deck crews, and air controllers, all with specialized skills that took years to develop. The Japanese discovered at Midway that losing experienced carrier aviators was even more devastating than losing the carriers themselves. Aircraft and ships could be replaced relatively quickly by major industrial powers, but training skilled carrier pilots took years. The United States possessed significant advantages in this regard. American industrial capacity could produce carriers, aircraft, and munitions in vast quantities. Meanwhile, the American educational system and aviation infrastructure could train large numbers of competent pilots. Japan, with its more limited industrial base and smaller pool of potential aviators, found replacing losses increasingly difficult as the war progressed. The carrier battles of 1942 demonstrated another crucial advantage of carrier warfare: reach and flexibility. Battleships needed to close to within 20 miles or less to engage effectively, requiring both fleets to locate each other precisely and maneuver for favorable position. This process could take days and often resulted in the enemy escaping before decisive action could occur. Carriers, by contrast, could strike at ranges exceeding 200 miles. This extended reach meant carriers could attack enemy forces that had no idea American ships were nearby. The carrier task force could approach under cover of weather or darkness, launch strikes at dawn, and withdraw before the enemy could effectively respond. This hit-and-run capability proved ideal for the vast distances of the Pacific, where traditional naval battles were extremely difficult to force upon an unwilling enemy. As the war progressed through 1943 and 1944, American industrial might began producing carriers in unprecedented numbers. The United States launched not only large fleet carriers, but also dozens of smaller escort carriers that provided air cover for convoys and amphibious operations. By mid-1944, the U.S. Navy operated more than a dozen fleet carriers organized into powerful task forces that could overwhelm any opposition. These carrier task forces supported the island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, providing air superiority over invasion beaches and striking Japanese bases hundreds of miles away. The fast task force became America's primary offensive weapon in the Pacific, capable of appearing anywhere, destroying enemy forces and installations, and withdrawing before effective counterattacks could be mounted.
The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 illustrated American carrier dominance at its peak. Japanese naval aviation had never recovered from the losses suffered at Midway and subsequent campaigns. By 1944, Japanese carrier aircrews were poorly trained compared to their American counterparts and flew inferior aircraft. When the Japanese fleet attempted to defend the Mariana Islands, American fighters massacred Japanese strike aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American pilots shot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft while suffering minimal losses. American submarines and carrier aircraft then sank 3 Japanese carriers, further gutting Japan's naval aviation capability. The battle demonstrated that carrier warfare required not just the ships themselves, but also well-trained crews, capable aircraft, and effective tactics. Japan no longer possessed these advantages. The final major carrier battle occurred at Leyte Gulf in October 1944 during the Philippines campaign. The Japanese, desperate to halt American advances, committed their remaining naval forces in a complex operation designed to destroy American amphibious forces at Leyte. The Japanese plan included using their remaining carriers as decoys to draw American carriers away from the landing beaches, allowing Japanese battleships to attack the vulnerable transports. The plan partially succeeded. American carriers took the bait and steamed north, leaving the landing area protected only by escort carriers and destroyers. However, even this advantage couldn't save the Japanese. American escort carriers and their destroyer escorts fought desperately against Japanese battleships and cruisers, buying time until American fleet carriers could return. Meanwhile, American carrier aircraft decimated the Japanese carrier force sent as bait, sinking all 4 Japanese carriers involved. The battle ended with the virtual destruction of Japanese naval power, accomplished primarily through carrier aviation. Leyte Gulf contained one final, haunting demonstration of the battleship's obsolescence. The Japanese battleship Musashi, one of the 2 largest battleships ever built, displacing 73,000 tons and mounting 9 18-inch guns, sailed into battle as part of the Japanese force. American carrier aircraft found Musashi and attacked relentlessly throughout the day. Wave after wave of torpedo bombers and dive bombers struck the massive vessel, which absorbed incredible punishment before finally capsizing and sinking, taking over 1,000 men with it. Despite its tremendous size, advanced design, and powerful armament, Musashi never fired its main guns at an enemy ship. The pride of Japanese battleship construction was destroyed by aircraft operating from carriers the battleship could neither reach nor effectively defend against. The symbolic significance was unmistakable. The battleship era had truly ended. The reasons for the carrier's decisive victory over the battleship extended beyond simple combat effectiveness to include fundamental changes in the nature of naval warfare. The Pacific War was fought across immense distances, with thousands of miles separating major objectives. Traditional naval battles required both sides to locate each other close to gun range and engage in direct combat. In the vast Pacific, such encounters were extremely rare. Carriers could search huge areas using reconnaissance aircraft, strike targets at extended range, and avoid unfavorable engagements entirely. This flexibility proved far more valuable than the battleship's heavily armored firepower, which was only useful if you could find the enemy and close to gun range, increasingly unlikely scenarios given carrier capabilities. Carriers also supported amphibious operations far more effectively than battleships. While battleship guns could bombard coastal targets, their effectiveness was limited by the relatively flat trajectory of naval gunfire and the difficulty of adjusting fire against inland targets. Carrier aircraft, by contrast, could attack targets anywhere within their operating radius, identify and destroy mobile defenders, and provide close air support for troops ashore. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, carrier air support proved essential for successful amphibious landings. The carriers provided the air superiority umbrella that protected landing forces from enemy air attack, while simultaneously striking enemy defenses and reinforcements. No concentration of battleships could have provided equivalent support. The technological evolution of naval aviation during World War II further accelerated the carrier's dominance. By 1945, American carrier aircraft had improved dramatically from their 1941 predecessors. The F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair fighters outperformed earlier designs and dominated Japanese opposition. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers had become more reliable and effective. Perhaps most importantly, American carriers had developed sophisticated combat information centers and fighter direction capabilities that allowed them to coordinate complex defensive and offensive operations. These advances made carriers even more formidable, while battleships remained essentially unchanged from their pre-war configurations, their capabilities frozen in a tactical paradigm that no longer matched reality.
Advantages: armor protection and survivability proved less significant than expected.
Carriers could be sunk or disabled by bomb and torpedo hits, but so could battleships when subjected to concentrated air attack, as the sinking of Prince of Wales, Musashi, and numerous other capital ships demonstrated. Meanwhile, carriers threatened enemy ships from distances that kept them relatively safe from counterattack. American carriers occasionally suffered serious damage from Japanese air attacks, but American damage control and construction techniques allowed many damaged carriers to return to action after repairs. The Japanese carrier Zuikaku survived from Pearl Harbor until October 1944, longer than many battleships that saw action. Survivability in combat proved less about armor thickness than about tactical flexibility and the ability to strike first from extended range. The industrial and economic dimensions of the carrier versus battleship question also favored carriers. Building a battleship required enormous resources and years of construction time. The largest battleships cost as much as several carriers, but could only be in one place at one time, engaging targets within gun range. Carriers, while expensive, could influence vast areas through their aircraft. More importantly, the United States found it could produce escort carriers rapidly using merchant ship hulls and standardized construction techniques. These smaller carriers lacked the speed and aircraft capacity of fleet carriers, but they adequately protected convoys and supported amphibious operations. America built over 100 escort carriers during the war, providing air coverage across the Pacific and Atlantic. No comparable mass production of battleships was even conceivable. The carrier better suited industrial warfare's demands for numbers and rapid production. By 1945, the transformation of naval warfare was complete and irreversible. The battleship had become a relic, retained primarily for shore bombardment and anti-aircraft escort duty, rather than its intended role as the ultimate arbiter of naval combat. The last battleship versus battleship surface action of the war occurred at Surigao Strait during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a night engagement where American battleships crossed the T and destroyed a Japanese force. A perfect execution of traditional battleship tactics that served mainly as a nostalgic farewell to an era already ended. The primary naval battles of the Pacific War were decided by carriers from the Coral Sea through Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. When Japan finally surrendered in Tokyo Bay in September 1945, the ceremony occurred aboard the battleship Missouri, but the Missouri rode at anchor, surrounded by scores of American carriers that had actually won the war. The post-war world confirmed what combat had already proven. The United States continued building and operating carriers while scrapping or mothballing most battleships. The Soviet Union, planning its post-war navy, focused on submarines and land-based aviation rather than battleships. Even Great Britain, whose Royal Navy had been built on battleship supremacy for centuries, shifted to carrier-centered fleets. A few battleships survived into the post-war era for shore bombardment and anti-aircraft escort duty, but no nation laid down a new battleship after World War II. The carrier had permanently replaced the battleship as the capital ship of modern navies, a revolution in military affairs as profound as any in history. Today's carrier battle groups trace their lineage directly to those World War II task forces that demonstrated carrier aviation's decisive advantages. The transformation from battleships to carriers as the dominant naval weapon represents more than just technological change. It exemplifies how warfare constantly evolves and how yesterday's
One of the most significant aspects of the carrier revolution was how it changed the relationship between naval power and geography. Battleships, despite their impressive range and firepower, were ultimately constrained by the need to operate within gun range of their targets. This meant that naval power could only be projected where ships could safely sail and where their guns could reach. Coastal defenses, minefields, and narrow straits could effectively neutralize even the most powerful battleship fleet. Carriers, by contrast, could strike targets hundreds of miles inland, rendering many traditional geographic barriers irrelevant. A carrier task force positioned several hundred miles offshore could attack targets that no surface fleet could previously reach.
This capability fundamentally altered strategic calculations about how navies could influence land campaigns and support national objectives. The Pacific War provided countless examples of this expanded reach. American carriers struck Tokyo in April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, in the famous Doolittle raid launched from the carrier Hornet. While this particular operation used land-based bombers operating from a carrier deck in a one-way mission, it demonstrated the principle that carriers could threaten even the enemy homeland from positions far at sea. Later in the war, carrier task forces routinely struck Japanese facilities across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Formosa to the Japanese home islands themselves. These attacks destroyed aircraft, sank ships, devastated industrial facilities, and disrupted logistics, all accomplished by a fleet that remained mobile and difficult to counterattack. No concentration of battleships could have achieved comparable results. The carrier's dominance also fundamentally changed naval logistics and support requirements. Battleships consumed enormous quantities of fuel oil, but their logistical needs were relatively straightforward: fuel, ammunition for their guns, and supplies for their crews. Carriers required far more complex support systems. Aircraft needed aviation fuel, which had different handling requirements than ship fuel. Carrier aircraft consumed tremendous quantities of ammunition, bombs, and torpedoes in diverse types and sizes. Most critically, carriers needed replacement aircraft and spare parts to maintain their air group's combat effectiveness. A carrier without functional aircraft was merely a vulnerable, expensive target. This meant that carrier operations required sophisticated logistics ships and systems, fleet oilers, ammunition ships, and aviation supply vessels that could replenish carriers at sea, allowing them to maintain operations for extended periods without returning to port. The United States developed underway replenishment to an art form during World War II, creating the logistical infrastructure that allowed American carrier task forces to operate continuously for months at a time. These logistics capabilities represented as much of a revolution as the carriers themselves. American task forces could refuel ships, transfer ammunition, and even fly replacement aircraft aboard while underway, maintaining combat capability without the vulnerability of entering port. The Japanese, despite their early tactical successes, never developed comparable underway replenishment capabilities. Japanese carriers frequently needed to return to port for resupply, reducing their operational availability and creating predictable patterns that American forces could exploit. The differential in logistics support significantly amplified America's material advantages and contributed substantially to ultimate victory. The human dimension of carrier warfare deserves particular emphasis because it represented such a departure from traditional naval service. Battleship crews certainly required training and skill, but carrier operations demanded entirely new specialties and levels of expertise. Flight deck operations were inherently dangerous, with aircraft launching and landing on a pitching deck surrounded by jet fuel, bombs, and spinning propellers. A single mistake could kill dozens of men and destroy multiple aircraft in seconds. Deck crews developed elaborate systems of color-coded uniforms and hand signals to coordinate the complex ballet of moving, fueling, arming, launching, and recovering aircraft. These procedures had to be executed flawlessly under combat conditions, often while the ship maneuvered violently to evade enemy attack. Carrier pilots faced challenges that no previous generation of warriors had encountered. They flew in 3 dimensions across vast distances over featureless ocean, navigated to targets using dead reckoning and limited radio aids, fought enemy aircraft and anti-aircraft fire, and then had to find their carrier and land on a moving deck that might be only a few hundred feet long. Navigation errors could leave aircraft lost over the Pacific with no hope of rescue once their fuel was exhausted. Combat damage could make landing impossible, forcing pilots to ditch in the ocean and hope for rescue by accompanying destroyers or submarines. The psychological stress of carrier aviation was immense, yet thousands of young men mastered these challenges and flew repeated combat missions. The quality of these aviators often mattered more than the quality of the carriers themselves, as Japan discovered when its pool of experienced pilots was depleted and could not be adequately replaced. The intelligence dimensions of carrier warfare also differed fundamentally from battleship-era naval combat. Battleships fought battles that unfolded over hours within visual range, where intelligence about enemy dispositions mattered but was not necessarily decisive. Carrier battles, by contrast, often hinged on intelligence, who found whom first and who struck first. The Battle of Midway turned on American codebreakers, providing Admiral Nimitz with detailed intelligence about Japanese plans, allowing American carriers to establish an ambush. Throughout the Pacific War, intelligence about enemy carrier locations and intentions often proved as important as material superiority. This placed new emphasis on reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and intelligence analysis as integral components of naval operations. Modern navies had always valued intelligence, but carrier warfare made it absolutely critical to survival and success. The implications extended to naval officer education and culture. The battleship navy had been dominated by surface warfare officers, typically men who had spent their careers aboard cruisers, destroyers, and battleships. These officers understood gunnery, armor, and surface tactics. The rise of carriers required a new type of naval leader, officers who understood aviation, air tactics, and the complexities of integrating air and surface operations. Many senior officers in 1941 had little understanding of aviation and were reluctant to trust this new weapon. The admirals who led American carrier operations to victory, men like Spruance, Halsey, and Mitcher, had to learn carrier warfare while fighting, adapting their thinking to match new realities. The post-war U.S. Navy would increasingly be led by aviators who had proven themselves in carrier combat, fundamentally changing the service's culture and priorities. The implications extended to naval officer education and culture. The battleship navy had been dominated by surface warfare officers, typically men who had spent their careers aboard cruisers, destroyers, and battleships. These officers understood gunnery, armor, and surface tactics. The rise of carriers required a new type of naval leader, officers who understood aviation, air tactics, and the complexities of integrating air and surface operations. Many senior officers in 1941 had little understanding of aviation and were reluctant to trust this new weapon. The admirals who led American carrier operations to victory, men like Spruance, Halsey, and Mitcher, had to learn carrier warfare while fighting, adapting their thinking to match new realities. The post-war U.S. Navy would increasingly be led by aviators who had proven themselves in carrier combat, fundamentally changing the service's culture and priorities. The strategic bombing campaigns against Japan in 1945 illustrated another dimension of carrier superiority. While Army Air Force's B-29 bombers based in the Marianas conducted the primary strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities and industry, carrier task forces provided crucial support by suppressing Japanese air defenses and attacking targets the B-29s couldn't easily reach. In the war's final months, American carriers operated directly off the Japanese coast with near impunity, their aircraft ranging over the home islands attacking targets of opportunity. These operations demonstrated that carriers could project sustained air power without requiring captured airfields or vulnerable fixed bases. The mobility and flexibility of carrier-based air power offered advantages even strategic bombers couldn't match in certain circumstances. The development of kamikaze tactics by Japan in late 1944 represented a desperate attempt to neutralize American carrier superiority. Recognizing they could no longer win conventional air battles against numerically superior and better-trained American forces, the Japanese turned to suicide attacks. Kamikaze aircraft laden with explosives deliberately crashed into American ships, particularly targeting carriers. These attacks inflicted serious losses and damage on American forces, especially during the Okinawa campaign in 1945. Several escort carriers were sunk by kamikazes, and several fleet carriers suffered significant damage. However, even kamikaze attacks ultimately failed to halt American carrier operations. American ships improved their anti-aircraft defenses, developed better fighter direction procedures, and accepted losses as the price of continued operations.
The kamikazes demonstrated that carriers were not invulnerable, but they also showed that even desperate tactics couldn't reverse the fundamental shift in naval warfare that carriers represented. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 raised immediate questions about the future of naval warfare and the carrier's place in it. Some theorists argued that nuclear weapons would render all surface ships obsolete, since a single atomic bomb could destroy an entire fleet. These concerns were not baseless. The post-war atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll demonstrated that nuclear weapons could indeed devastate naval forces. However, these predictions of the carrier's obsolescence proved premature. Instead, carriers adapted to the nuclear age, eventually becoming platforms for delivering nuclear weapons themselves. More importantly, the reality of nuclear warfare, its catastrophic consequences, and the doctrine of mutually assured destruction meant that most conflicts would remain conventional. In these conventional conflicts, carriers retained all their World War II advantages while incorporating new technologies like jet aircraft and guided missiles. The immediate post-war period saw intense debates within the U.S. military about force structure and priorities. The newly independent U.S. Air Force argued that land-based strategic bombers could fulfill national security requirements more effectively and economically than carrier battle groups. This dispute, known as the Revolt of the Admirals, pitted Navy leaders defending carrier aviation against Air Force advocates of strategic bombing. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 largely settled this debate in the Navy's favor. Carriers provided the only immediately available air power to support American and South Korean forces in the war's desperate early days. Throughout the Korean War, carriers flew close air support missions, attacked North Korean logistics, and helped establish air superiority, exactly the flexible power projection capabilities demonstrated in World War II. The Korean War validated carrier aviation's continued relevance and ensured carriers would remain the centerpiece of American naval power.
The technological evolution of carrier aviation in the post-war decades built directly on World War II foundations while incorporating revolutionary advances. Jet aircraft, first introduced near the end of World War II, offered dramatic improvements in speed and performance, but required carriers with larger decks, more powerful catapults, and better arresting gear. British innovations like the angled flight deck and steam catapult, developed in the 1950s, allowed carriers to operate high-performance jets safely and efficiently. These technologies, quickly adopted by the U.S. Navy, transformed carriers into even more formidable weapons. The introduction of nuclear propulsion with the commissioning of USS Enterprise in 1961 eliminated the carrier's need for refueling, allowing truly unlimited range and endurance limited only by crew supplies and aircraft maintenance. The Vietnam War provided another demonstration of carrier power projection capabilities. Carriers stationed in the South China Sea and Gulf of Tonkin conducted sustained air operations over North and South Vietnam for years, launching tens of thousands of sorties against targets throughout the theater. While the Vietnam War's ultimate outcome was shaped by political and strategic factors beyond naval aviation's control, carriers proved they could maintain high-tempo operations indefinitely, supporting ground forces and striking enemy targets with precision. The ability to keep carriers on station continuously beyond the reach of enemy ground forces illustrated advantages that World War II carrier advocates had predicted decades earlier. Carriers offered a politically useful middle option between doing nothing and committing large ground forces, providing visible military presence and strike capability without requiring host nation bases or overflight rights. The Falklands War in 1982 offered a unique modern test of carrier operations in a high-intensity conventional conflict. When Argentina seized the Falkland Islands, Britain faced the challenge of retaking territories 8,000 miles from home with no nearby bases. The British task force centered on two small carriers, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, operating Harrier jump jets. Despite serious limitations, the British carriers were far smaller than American supercarriers and operated far fewer aircraft. They provided the air cover and strike capability essential for the successful amphibious recapture of the islands. The Falklands War demonstrated that even modest carrier forces could be decisive in expeditionary operations where land-based air power was unavailable. The war also highlighted carrier vulnerability when Argentina's air-launched Exocet missiles sank several British ships, showing that threats to carriers continued to evolve alongside carrier capabilities. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the American supercarrier had evolved into the most powerful weapons platform ever created. Modern Nimitz and Ford-class carriers displace over 100,000 tons and operate air wings of 70 to 80 aircraft, including FA-18 Super Hornets, EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft, E-2 Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft, and various helicopters. These carriers can generate over 200 combat sorties per day, striking targets across a radius of hundreds of miles with precision-guided munitions. Their nuclear propulsion provides virtually unlimited range and endurance. Modern carrier strike groups integrate cruisers, destroyers, and submarines equipped with Aegis combat systems and an array of sophisticated sensors and weapons, creating a layered defense that would have been inconceivable to World War II designers. Yet despite dramatic technological advances, the fundamental principles that made carriers superior to battleships in World War II remain unchanged. Carriers project power at distances where the carrier itself remains relatively secure from counterattack. Carriers provide flexible response options, from showing the flag to conducting sustained combat operations. Carriers can quickly respond to crises worldwide without requiring host nation permission or established bases. These advantages, first proven in the Pacific War, continued to make carriers the centerpiece of American naval power and the foundation of America's ability to project military force globally. The 10 or 11 American supercarriers currently in service represent more carrier capability than the rest of the world's navies combined, a dominance as complete as the battleship superiority Britain once enjoyed, but far more flexible and useful across the spectrum of conflict. The story of how carriers replaced battleships also offers broader lessons about military innovation and institutional adaptation. Naval establishments worldwide resisted carrier aviation initially, not from stupidity, but from institutional inertia and the weight of accumulated experience. Battleships had proven themselves over decades. Carriers were unproven and risky. Officers who had spent careers mastering battleship operations naturally doubted whether these newfangled aircraft carriers could really replace the mighty dreadnoughts. This resistance was entirely human and understandable, yet it was ultimately wrong. The institutions that adapted quickest to the new reality, primarily the U.S. Navy after Pearl Harbor forced adaptation, gained decisive advantages. Those that clung longest to battleship thinking, particularly the Japanese Navy, which continued building battleships late into the war, suffered accordingly.
Modern militaries continue to face similar challenges as new technologies emerge and threaten to disrupt established ways of warfare. Unmanned systems, cyber warfare, hypersonic missiles, and other innovations are creating pressure for adaptation comparable to the transition from battleships to carriers. The World War II experience suggests that successful militaries will be those that objectively assess new technologies, conduct realistic experiments and exercises, and maintain flexibility in thinking about how future wars might be fought. Institutional resistance to change is natural and sometimes even healthy. Not every new technology truly revolutionizes warfare. But when fundamental changes in warfare occur, militaries must adapt or face defeat by more innovative adversaries, just as battleship-centered navies were swept aside by carrier aviation. The human cost of the carrier revolution deserves recognition. The sailors who went down with battleships at Pearl Harbor, the carrier pilots who flew into anti-aircraft fire over enemy fleets, the deck crews killed in flight deck accidents, and the thousands of others who died learning how to wage carrier warfare paid an enormous price for the transition. These men fought and died not just for immediate victory, but to establish the principles and procedures that would guide naval aviation for generations. Modern carrier operations benefit from doctrines developed through bitter experience by the pioneers of carrier warfare.
Every procedure for launching aircraft safely, every tactic for attacking enemy ships, every method for defending against air attack was learned at tremendous cost during World War II. The smooth efficiency of modern carrier operations represents the accumulated wisdom purchased with the lives of those who fought the first carrier battles. As we look back across the decades since World War II, the completeness of the carrier's victory over the battleship seems almost inevitable. Yet, at the time, the outcome was far from certain. Powerful voices within every navy argued that battleships remained essential. Some believed carriers could supplement but never replace the big gunships. Reality proved otherwise. The last battleship versus battleship engagement occurred in 1944. The last battleship built by any nation entered service in the 1940s. Meanwhile, carriers have grown steadily more capable and more central to naval power projection. The United States is currently building the next generation of supercarriers, while no nation even considers building a new battleship. The verdict of history could not be clearer. The story of carriers replacing battleships reminds us that military power is not static, but constantly evolving. The weapons that seem most powerful today may be rendered obsolete by tomorrow's innovations. The carriers that dominate today's seas may themselves be replaced by future technologies, perhaps unmanned systems, perhaps weapons we cannot yet imagine. What remains constant is the need for militaries to embrace innovation, to question assumptions, and to adapt to changing realities. The admirals who recognized carrier aviation's potential and the sailors who mastered carrier operations under fire created a revolution in naval warfare whose effects persist to this day. Their achievement stands as testament to human adaptability and the power of innovation to transform warfare. The mighty battleship, once the undisputed ruler of the waves, passed into history, replaced by a weapon that proved more suited to modern warfare's demands. And somewhere in the future, perhaps another revolution awaits, ready to transform war at sea once again.